I've mentioned in past videos and articles and AMAs my affection for the term Bonjwa, which actually comes from the South Korean StarCraft Brood War scene, which was a term created by fans there. And I actually did a video along this topic, explaining why it's a great term, but why unfortunately fans, especially Western fans, kind of took the term and bastardized the logic behind it and somewhat ruined the way it could be used as an excellent additional way of modeling great players through history who weren't just great players, but were like definitively the best at one point in time. So I'll link that video up there. And one day I'll probably make a very short video just to explain the concept of what I think a Bonjwas should be. And I haven't made it yet, but I guess one day, if you're watching this in the future, like 6 months from now, maybe I'll link that like over there if I make it. Actually, that's ridiculous. Like that might be egregious. I mean, yeah, and also, guys, if I ever actually do crack the magical secret of turning base metals like lead into gold, then I'll link that up there, and you too can use my alchemical secret to become prosperous and wealthy beyond your dreams. So, anyway. Short version, Bonjwa as a term is a way of differentiating between people who were not only some of the greatest players and great players, but had the special distinction of also being the absolute greatest of a particular period of time, where usually you have to have won a bunch in that period of time and just distinguish yourself from even the other great players of your era. And so as a result, you are the Bonjwa, which basically the term essentially translates to the player or person who stands above all others. So we can see this is a great term, because now what we're going to do when we look at the Bonjwas of League is we're not just looking at the greatest players of all time, because you know what? Some of the greatest players of all time played at the same time. So Mata played at the same time as Faker did. You have the same career length. Then you have people like Wei Zhao played at the same time as Alex Ich. So how do we evaluate who was the Bonjwa of these guys? Was there a Bonjwa? Were there Bonjwas in league history? Now I think if you actually correctly apply the term and are reasonable with it, then you'll be able to find Bonjwas in every single big competitive esports game. It's just you have to be careful how you define it, and you have to be very reasonable with it. Like, just because someone was a truly great player, you don't just throw them in there. So for example, I actually think that Bisu in StarCraft Brood, ultimately I consider him a greater player than Boxer. Now, I could go to many reasons there, but this isn't a StarCraft Brood video. But Boxer was a Bonjwa in a way that Bisu wasn't, because he was the one player for a period of time that did stand above all the others and was the greatest at that time, in a way that Bisu wasn't, because he had other competitors at the time. It was a failed Bonjwa, in fact. So, for League of Legends, first and foremost, we're going to mainly do this with teams. It doesn't really seem that much point to do it with individual players, not least because in team games it tends to be harder to distinguish yourself as the Bonjwa. So we'll start with teams here, okay? So first of all, we'll go chronologically through history. In the early days of League, Season 1, I actually don't think we can have a Bonjwa here, because the big problem is, I know people are already going to go, people who study history, in fact, and we're back then, they're going, but wait a minute, that should be CLG, right? The North American team with Big Fat LP and Chowster and Hotshot GG should be this team. This should be the Bonjwa team, right? Problem with that is, there were just way too few lands at the time. All the competition was online then. In fact, a lot of the things that you've heard mythologized, if you're not someone who was around back then, go back and watch these games. And I don't mean watch the game because it's not very developed. I mean, the competitions are non-existent. Like that CLG team that people were talking about there, the one with Big Fat LP and Kobe, etc., that lineup won one LAN tournament, which was, yes, it was a World Cyber Games, which at the time was a major in games like CS and well, Quake wasn't in it anymore, CS and games like that. But this tournament was an invitational tournament. Well, actually, I guess some of the roles weren't in the invitational, but it only had 4 teams there. Oh, no, that wasn't invitational, that one. It only had 4 teams at the whole LAN. One of them was essentially like an SK European team, and one of them was just some like random Asian team and didn't even have a server at the time. This is not a big-time tournament. This cannot be compared, even relative to its era, to the great tournaments of later, of Season 2, Season 3, Season 4, Season 5. So actually, in Season 1, I don't think there was a Bonjwa, because once you get past that CLG team, you get to the era of teams like Fnatic win Season 1 Championship and IEM New York, but then they don't do that well in some of the other tournaments. And they had a big slump, actually. And at the same time that they're winning these tournaments, that's when the other CLG NA team came along and started to win tournaments with St. Vicious. But then that team, even though they won 2 tournaments, they actually had standards for both their team tournament wins. So as a result, you can't really look at them and say, oh, they were the Bonjwa. So in this era, it's too confused. There is no Bonjwa team in Season 1 for me. Now, when you come into Season 2, I think there's an obvious Bonjwa we can start with, which is Moscow 5. For the first, I think it was the first 5 tournaments, they won 4 of these 5 tournaments. They won IEM Katowice, they won the IEM World Championship in Hanover, they won, let me think what else, they lost DreamHack Summer, to CLG but then they won ECC Poland over CLG and then they won the regional in Europe. So 5 tournaments. And you have to remember, at the time, Korea was still getting going. So Europe was overall the best region for the first half of this part of the year at least. And when they won the IEM World Championship, at the time, that was absolutely one of the best tournaments ever held in League of Legends history. It was more competitive than the Season 1 Championship. It wasn't as competitive as Season 2 Worlds, but that was later in the year. We hadn't had OGN leagues and stuff at this point in time in terms of big ones. So this was the best tournament we'd had at that point in time. And essentially, yeah, Koreans weren't really in the game at the time. They were just starting to get going. Chinese teams, admittedly, the best on World League couldn't attend, but it had all the best North American and European teams, and they won it in dominant fashion without losing a game. In fact, over this span of the first 5 tournaments, off the top of my head, I think I had this stat somewhere. They won something, I think it was 32 offline games out of 38 played. So incredibly dominant. Even the one team that did beat them, CLGEU, offline at least, because online they had a very competitive back and forth. They came back, they beat them, and were impressive in doing so. So for me, Oscar 5 is the obvious Bonjwas of Season 2. Yeah, they didn't win the end. They stopped being a Bonjwas at Season 2 Worlds, and that in many ways marked their downfall, but they were definitely the Bonjwas, the ultimate team for the first 6 to 8 months of the year, and this was a very solid run for me. Now, beyond that, towards the end of the year, we get World Elite. They certainly can be considered a Bonjwas. Because you have to realise, there's a few things about World Elite that people don't understand. That team I'm talking about that was the very famous one, the Chalme. Maybe I should go through all the rosters for these teams as well. So the Moscow 5 team, by the way, obviously was Darien, Diamond Prox, Alex H, Genja, and Gosu Pepper, aka Edward. Now, World Elite, this was the team that had Chalme, Salme, they actually supposed to say, apparently, top laner. They had Clearlove jungler, they had Messiah mid lane, they had Wei Zhao as the AD carry, the superstar player, and they had FCZF as the support player. Now, after they changed their lineup, one of their first big events was Season 2 Worlds. This is where they narrowly got beaten in that very upsetting fashion by CLGU with all the replays. But what people don't know is, after that tournament, they went home and started this utterly crazy run, which I'll probably document one day because it's never been given its full due, where they had something crazy. Like they went something like 33 series in a row without a loss domestically and including international competition. They not only won IPL 5, one of the most stacked tournaments ever, admittedly not with as many elite Korean teams as he'd want, but every other sort of great team at the time, and Koreans weren't like hands down the best at the time. So absolutely won an incredible international competition in very dominant fashion as well, dropping very few games. But they also won WEM, which had some international teams there, including Incredible Miracle and Curse, NA. So they had some tournaments where they also had other international competition. Then they had this amazing dominance domestically, and obviously they invented a lot of things, or at least they perfected some aspects of like lane swapping, split pushing, late game team fighting with the AD carry, roaming mid, lots of incredible things, and they really were the dominant team. I mean, just like Moscow 5, they not only were the dominant team and won and beat all the rivals, but they also were able to innovate things in the games, which is also something in StarCraft Brood War that they considered a quality of the Bonjwas. Even though I don't think it has to be. I think if you're just really dominant, that can count as well. So World Elite certainly should count as a Bonjwas. So we've got 2 Bonjwas so far. So now we come into Season 3. Now in Season 3, I think it's pretty obvious who the Bonjwas is going to be. It's SK Telecom T1. We're talking about the classic lineup in 2013. Impact top lane, Bengi jungle, Faker mid lane, the main star carry, Piglet secondary carry, AD carry, and Pumandu support player. So, in my opinion, the greatest League of Legends team of all time, and I've still yet to see a team that truly comes close to them in scope of how good they are, how effective they were at their style, how incredible they were compared to all the other teams of their era, in that they played in a very competitive era, and how far above they were these other teams in general. So for me, obvious one. I mean, they won the OGN Summer Tournament, admittedly narrowly, but then they won Worlds with a very dominant record, and then they won the winter season without dropping a single game, going 15-0. Now, yeah, along the way, they lost that WCG qualifier, but it's not that you can never lose. To be a Bonjwa doesn't mean you never lose. In fact, all those StarCraft Brood Wars, every single one of them had a period during when they're considered the Bonjwa, where, for example, there might be 2 competitions going on, like there were in Brood War, like the OSL and the MSL. And they might have won the OSL, but they might have bombed out in the MSL, and that doesn't stop you being the Bonjwa. Because, okay, you lost on that day, but you still were above everyone else overall. It's not like that person who beat you on that one day was now the best player above all. No. That's not always the case. So absolutely SK Telecom, obviously a Bonjwa. Now, once you go beyond that, there are still some candidates who are reasonable to put as Bonjwas. So a lot of people, again, might think that this is, maybe people take exception to this, I don't know, but I would consider Samsung Blue of 2014 a Bonjwa team, because first season of the tournament, the first tournament of the season, which technically... I mean, I guess some people might consider winner, but I guess he's actually considering the circuit points winner. But okay, first tournament of 2014 would have been the Spring OGN, and they won this tournament. Then in the Masters tournament between the two seasons, they won that, and they were very much the best team, even in the Samsung organization. There, they won that. So they won two competitions where they did play as their own team and did play against top teams. Then on top of that, they made it to the final of OGN Summer, and they lost in the last game of the final in an incredible series. It really was one of the closest finals I've ever seen in my entire life. So to me, even though they lost at the end of that, it's not like, by the way, at that tournament, even though KT Arrows won it, KT Arrows were not better than Samsung Blue. They beat them, and they played better in one key game or in one small part of a game, and they won the final, but they weren't a better team. And you saw that in the regional. So for me, over the year, when you consider this, and then they still made top 4 at Worlds. At Worlds, they dropped off a bit, and they weren't quite the Bonjwas as we saw, because Samsung White was much better at that point in time. But for the first 6 to 8 months of the year, Blue were the Bonjwa team, and they did enough to me to earn this Bonjwa status, in the same way that Moscow 5 did, even though they didn't win Worlds. So we've got up to Blue there. Now, here's the one that's very, very difficult, okay, is that actually I would not consider Samsung White a Bonjwa team. And I'll go into that in a minute. So I'm going to skip them, actually. So we already got Moscow 5, World Elite, SK Telecom, Samsung Blue. I didn't go through the Samsung Blue lineup, but I'll just do it now quickly. So it's obviously Acorn top lane, Spirit jungle, Dade mid lane, Deft AD carry, and Heart support player. So we got Moscow 5, World Elite, SK Telecom, the first one, Samsung Blue. Got 4 Bonjwas so far, and I'm going to add one final Bonjwa, a 5th Bonjwa. So we're actually going to have the same number of Bonjwas as StarCraft Brood War had. So the 5th Bonjwa, unsurprisingly, is SK Telecom of 2015. So they won the spring split, admittedly having to overcome GE Tigers. They had second place at MSI, but even then, very narrow loss. Then they won the summer split in very dominant fashion, one of the most dominant wins ever, very, very impressive. And then they won Worlds in very dominant fashion. So for me, inarguable, they are a Bonjwa team. They're absolutely incredible. They're one of the best teams of all time, without a doubt. So at the moment, I have 5 Bonjwa teams. Now, what's interesting is, to show you the differentiation and how I've qualified who gets to be a Bonjwa, there are some failed Bonjwas in history, just as there are in Brood War. The most famous in Brood War, I mean, some people say Jaedong, but I actually consider Jaedong a Bonjwa because I have my own reasoning, and which you could see in the video that I mentioned before. I would say Bisu is the most obvious failed Bonjwa in the history of Brood War. Well, there are some obvious ones in League of Legends. So again, we'll go chronologically. The first one is actually going to be Azubu Frost of 2012. Because you have to realize, if you track their tournament performances, they had some really nuts runs. So what they did is they won the OGN Invitational early in the year and beat CLG. This was a tournament that had World Elite at it. It had Najin there. They won that like 14 but very stacked Invitational tournament. Then in the spring, they were the favourites to win the inaugural OGN actual season, OGN Spring. But here's what's key. They got upset by their sister team, Blaze, and lost in a sweep in the final. So that already set them back on being the Bonjwas, but they're still doing this incredible record. OGN Summer, they make it to the final. They win the OGN title, the one big tournament this lineup won. But what's the problem? It was in 5 games. It was actually very close. It wasn't particularly a dominant win. So again, stopping you being Bonjwa, despite the fact you're showing you're an all-time great, excellent team. Then they go to Worlds. At Worlds, they make the final. They're the favourite to win. They get upset by Taipei Assassins. And in some of the games, weren't even close. So you got humiliated there. They go home. They actually make it to semi-finals of IEM Katowice, playing Gambit. They're the favourite. They get beaten there, and actually beaten in terms of just the other guys played their comfort champions and wrecked them. So disappointing there. The only tournament with this little run, at least, that they didn't make the final. But they make the final of the OGN Winter Tournament. They're the favourite again. They play Najin Sword. Najin Sword sweeps them 3-0. So the problem with Frost is they've shown us actually with their pedigree and their consistent excellence that they were a truly great team who were contending to be like a Bonjwa type team. But even when they won, it wasn't convincing. And all the other times, it was very unconvincing when they lost. And they were clearly a failed attempt at doing so. Even though they could have been the Season 2 Bonjwa if they won all these tournaments, which they were in position to do so, and they were the favourite many, many times. So they're a failed Bonjwa. Then in early 2013, we have another potential Bonjwa, and it's another CJ team. Obviously, Azubu Frost became CJ Frost, which is CJ enters Blaze in early 2013. So at the beginning of the year, they'd made the semi-finals of OGN Winter, and they'd come really close actually to beating Frost and making the finals and beating at the time Frost was like the better of the two teams and overcoming their sister team as it were, as they had famously done the year before, but with Flame as the top laner instead of Reapered. But they lost these two best of, because interestingly that semi-final of that tournament had a best of 5 format, but you played 2 best of 5s. And by the way, if it was tied, they were going to play a 1-game decider between the two, which is absolutely mental. But luckily, that never happened. Blaze lost these 2 best of 5s, 2-3 in both of them. So they got in the semis there, but then they go to IEM Katowice. They make the final, and they're playing Gambit, but they lose out there. Again, similar fashion, Gambit humiliate them. But this is when they kick into the Bonjwa mode, because they go back home, and in OGN Spring, they start rolling, and they quickly become the best team in all of Korea. And they become a team who's started to roll, and then they go to the IEM World Championship. And at this tournament, they're the best team there. They beat Frost in the final 3-1. They win the whole tournament, a big international tournament at the time. They've won that. Then they go home. They get this 6 streak going where they win 13 games in a row in OGN Champions, including sweeping 2 series. They beat Najin Sword. They beat... Oh, no, it wouldn't have been Najin Sword. Let me think. They beat SK Telecom, the Reapered one first, and then they beat CJ Enters Frost in the semi-finals. But famously, at the moment when they're on the brink of becoming the Bonjwa, they lose out to MVP Ozone, famously get swept in the final. So that breaks them. They don't become the Bonjwa. That was the moment where if you add in the IEM, you add in the overall success, you add in this build-up, then you add in this streak, and they add the innovation. They brought this great late-game style of play, where they used to give up early dragons to farm up all the gold onto Ambition and Flame, and they would carry the game late, and you couldn't beat them, and they could even have Flame off farming, and they would fight you 4v5 and win. This style was absolutely game-breaking at the time, and using minion wave control to win the game, absolutely incredible stuff. And if they'd won that OGN, I think most people would have considered them to have superseded World Elite, even though they wouldn't have played them directly, because World Elite hadn't been playing international competitions early in that year, and World Elite had now gotten into the position where they had lost domestically themselves to Invictus Gaming. So Blaze would have become the Bonjwa, but they didn't. They failed. They were a failed Bonjwa, and they would never again rise to that height. Now, another person who is a potential Bonjwa, we're going to go to Samsung White Season 5. Now, the reason why they're a failed Bonjwa is actually the end part of their run, before they all went off to China, they did all they needed to do to complete becoming a Bonjwa. Their problem was, earlier in the year, they were so unconvincing. So, first tournament of the year, I mean, technically all the tournaments that year, but you have to count the ones where they had this particular... Actually, I guess you also can't count Frost as a Bonjwa, because if you think about it, actually... Well, unlike all these other lineups I'm listing, they changed players, because they changed from Woong being a top laner to having Shy as the top laner. So actually, I guess Frost wouldn't count anyway. I hadn't really thought that through. Okay, so if you get to Samsung White, I guess it also doesn't count for Winter, because they had Dada then. So in Spring, OGN Spring 2014, they were a dominant team. They looked like they were going to win OGN. They lost to their sister team. Got beaten quite convincingly, actually, in the semi-finals. Masters, again, they're fantastic. The only team that they wouldn't be able to beat maybe is Blue, but they did have to play them because they're in the same organization. They win Masters, great. Then you go into the summer season. Again, they're looking fantastic. They spank SK Telecom, go into the semis. This time it's a closer one. Again, they lose out to Blue. So they're already in trouble right there. Then they come to Worlds, absolutely incredible. One of the most dominant Worlds runs you will ever see. They really could have gone undefeated if they hadn't, if they had have really wanted to do so, essentially. If they hadn't fucked around and hadn't been a part of their nature and part of the arrogance and swagger of that team. One of the most dominant runs we've ever seen. So that part's incredible. If they'd have just won one of those OGNs, or they'd have had closer games against Blue, or they'd really have come close, they'd made some more finals of OGNs, they might have been a Bonjwa. But for me, even though they had the incredible end, the amazing dominance that you want at the end, they didn't have the rest of it. The rest of it was missing, and it was underwhelming, and it showed that they weren't standing above all the others, because they couldn't even beat Blue in that sense. So, and also they had an incredibly close series against Blaze, if you remember. So, there's one more failed Bonjwa, and I think many of you probably won't even remember this, even though it happened this year. You probably have erased it from your memories. The team that was GE Tigers, later Coup Tigers, who ended up finishing second at Worlds and third in OGN Summer, when they were second in OGN Spring, this team had the chance to be Bonjwas. Because first of all, for the majority of the regular split of Spring, this team was incredibly dominant. They were winning every best of three, and they were winning some of these best of threes just by a landslide. And this style of innovation, bringing out the Juggernaut, was very, very effective, and no one could handle it when they did it. And you had to just straight up ban out the Lulu against them. And there was just nothing you could do against this team. They were so fucking good. Prey was absolutely in beast mode. Playing on Corki, playing on Cogmore. This team looked like they were going to become the next best team in the world and be a world's champion potentially. But they got stopped. They started to finally lose a few games. They went to IEM. They obviously got humiliated there by World Elite in 2 games in the semi-finals. Then they come back home, and famously, obviously, they're in the final because they'd finished with the best record. But SK Telecom comes in, just uses Easy Hoon, and actually just mops the floor with them. And even worse, it's not even like history gave them a chance, because actually CJ had done super well in the semis against SKT and came close to winning that series. And if CJ had made it, I think actually GE Tigers could have won this and kept the potential Bonjwas hood relevant and a chance, but they didn't. SK Telecom beat them. Then in the summer, they were a very good team again. They were having this great win streak. I think it was like 8 best of 3s in a row or something. But SKT was having a better win streak. SKT did better overall. Coup Tigers didn't even make the final. They lost to KT Rolster there. Worlds was again an excellent performance. They were in position to be an all-time great team, but they couldn't beat SK Telecom. You can't expect anyone to. They already did fantastically to smash Fnatic, to do very well against KT Rolster, to beat CLG twice, although admittedly they did lose to Flash Wolves twice, so that's not really very good. So you can see they were quite tenuous to ever be a Bonjwas. They probably weren't going to be if you look back now, but they had positions where they could have been perhaps. So you can see there's the Bonjwas, there's the failed Bonjwas. Now in terms of individually, it's a lot less point doing it in League of Legends. There's just too many great players, and as a game, I don't think it allows you to differentiate yourself as an all-time great player to the same way that other games do. Like in CSGO, the key thing is, it doesn't matter if my team's losing and my team's actually worse. I can still have just as good weaponry, so essentially just as good tools to win the game with as any other player in the game, as long as my team has money. Whereas obviously in League, when your team gets behind, the other team gets items, which means better stats, and they get gold leads, and they get positional map pressure, where they can take dragons and get buffs from it, and all these sorts of benefits that the player on the losing team who might be better than them might not have, and so you might not be able to show how great he is. Likewise, in Dota, even if your team is losing, first of all, levels essentially make your champion better, not just you don't get the stats always from items in the same way. It's actually a different breakdown in the way that Dota works. And more importantly, you can still, as long as he's doing well, you can still have that one carry, whether it's the mid laner or the top laner, who you farm up enough that he can still potentially win the game late. That doesn't exist the same way in League of Legends. So it's harder to have individual Bonjwas who clearly did stand above the rest, unless they were just someone on the best team anyway. And I think that's sometimes unfair in League. But there's obviously one Bonjwas, isn't there? There's one person who did separate themselves and did stand above all others and has truly proven to be untouchable when he was at his best, and that's Faker. Now, even if you dispute in Season 5, I think in the summer of Season 5 he was utterly untouchable, but Season 3, there's no debating. For the last half of Season 3, this guy was utterly unreal, could do whatever he wanted, could hard carry any game, had the most crazy champion pool, was a master of even the meta champions, of stuff like the Ahri, the Orianna, but then was a god on anything else he seemed to want to play, Riven, whatever else it might be. He was absolutely above and beyond any other player in the entire world. Meanwhile, all the other great players in history we think of, so there was times when people like Froggen, Wei Zhao, Dade, these guys at times were the best player in the world. But the difference is they were never totally untouchable by the other best players. And they were often the best player, but there'd be another player, as I'm mentioning in this list here, like Froggen. Okay, well, there was Wei Zhao, and he played a different role, and they were both extremely very good, and it was hard to differentiate between the two, and they were so ingrained in their team's style. Faker was just the best, period. I mean, you can obviously go into it, but I'm saying there wasn't any need to put a caveat on why he was the best or how he was the best in the same particular sense. So the only real Bonjwas individually is Faker. Now, if you want to talk about the Bonjwas of fantasy esports side, that would obviously be Alpha Draft, right? It's the site that stands above all the others. All the rest are pretty much irrelevant and don't need to be mentioned here because Alpha Draft exists. So they're the one that they win the most. You could go there and win the most. They're the team who've innovated with these awesome contests they have and all different like levels of contests and small ones and free ones for the little scrub lords. You know who you are. Ones for the ballers. Again, you know who you are. They're also the ones where they've never actually failed in being the best. As far as I can tell, they've just consistently been the best, day after day, putting in work. So if you want to play fancy esports, play at alphadraft.com.